What's up, everybody? Jay Miller here, bringing another Productivity in Tech podcast. I am a developer who is passionate about helping other developers create things for other developers. That's a mouthful. So I'm here with Jonathan Magen, and Jonathan is someone that I met, about 2 years ago now?
It is Magen. Thank you.
Yeah, about 2 years ago when I was looking into doing a little bit more with automation and automation things, and we connected on Twitter and have been kind of just online stalking each other since. And I sent him a message out earlier this week saying, "Hey, you ever been on a podcast?" And he was like, no. I'm like, "Do you want to be on one?" He's like, "Sure, let's do it." So we're here and we're going to talk about some stuff. So for the listeners out there, tell everyone a little bit about yourself and what you do.
All right. So my name is Jonathan. I'm really grateful that I have the chance to be here. So thanks, Jay. And I'm a computer scientist, and I like to say that I build imaginary objects for money as a job. I work in the healthcare sector for a large multinational, whatever comes after multinational healthcare company. And it's a wonderful place to work. I really like the fact that there are so many opportunities for automation, right? Because this is the Productivity in Tech podcast, but there's a lot more than that. So I think that it's sort of fitting, Jay, that you and I first bonded over automation.
Absolutely. And I think that was what made it so interesting, is that when I think of large companies, I always think of like it had to have everything together to get so large. So in my mind, there wouldn't be a lot of opportunities for automation, but often our perceived reality and actual reality are very different.
Right. So I think that one of the things I would challenge the notion that a company has to have their things together in order to succeed. And I would say that might be true in the absence of capital, but capital overcomes a lot. Right. So the ability to hire people and create potentially what you and I would call an inefficient system can still be good enough. Right. And I think that your experience in the Marines probably has taught you about those kinds of situations as well.
It's interesting with that too, because, in the Marine Corps, you would see things that were completely backwards, and you're like, how are we managing, we're considered like the greatest fighting force in the world or whatever. And like, you have people who have literally never lived outside of their parents' homes that make up like people with top secret security clearances and are like the last bastion of security before like international secrets get released. And sometimes it shows, but I definitely can understand how you can have a large company or military branch or any type of organization that while again from the outside it may look like everything's being held together, but in reality it's all being held together with like duct tape.
Right. And I think that goes to, that old notion of sort of the duct tape programmer, right? Not as a bad thing, but as someone who's able to sort of apply duct tape judiciously, right? And therefore achieve something awesome. Now, when you were in the Marines, right? Like it wasn't, I mean, I'm sure it was more than security clearance, but did you see operational things that also felt kind of backwards to you?
Sometimes, and I will say that there were often times where things looked backwards as I was in the position, but then once I had been promoted to a higher level, I noticed like, okay, this is why this was this way. Now it makes sense to me. As much as it sucked at the time, it's kind of the best option that we have.
Right, right. And that's something that I've really struggled with as I've, sort of gained seniority and amassed experience over time, right? It sort of makes me really wonder, like, there's always a reason. It might not be a reason that you like, it might not be a reason that you consider to be good, but there's always a reason that something is a certain way. And I think that that has a lot there's a lot that we can learn from that fact, but there's also a lot that we can learn from encountering that fact in the wild.
Absolutely. And the thing is, we can often use duct tape, or I guess in our case, like those automations, to really highlight an area that needs work. In fact, that's one of the things that I do regularly with the audio and video editing that I do. So, one of the video tools that I use, just because it's what my client wanted me to use, is Camtasia. And Camtasia is a really cool screen capture, like, video creation tool. However, it's not the premier video editing tool. So while capturing, your content is great, editing it and publishing it and getting everything dialed in the way you want it to, not really the best. But for me, what I would do is I would have to create a process that would take the audio side of that video, remove it from the video, then work in it, and then put it all back together seamlessly. And in my mind, I'm like, it would just be easier if Camtasia had better editing functions, or if they allowed me to use some of the tools that I already use. And in the latest update, they actually did put in some fixes. So it was like, I'm sitting here like hitting keyboard maestro commands, and then all of a sudden it's like, oh, I don't have to do this anymore. And that's one of the greatest feelings ever, whenever you have an automation that made something very simple that is finally eliminated, or the need for that automation is eliminated from your system.
Right. And I think that when you use the word process, right, like you used it in a very interesting way, because software and automation is most effective. It's not the only time it's effective, but it's most effective when you have a repeatable process, right?
Right.
So I think that that's one of those things, like when you were hitting those keyboard maestro commands, that was because you could rely on the repeatability of the process that you had devised and the process that you had created. So I think that that comes back to, in many ways, what you see in these larger organizations where there's a ton of process, right? And that process, if it's repeatable, can be automated and oftentimes optimized in the process.
Yeah, and that's the big key, is that you have to be able to identify the process before you can start going in and automating things. And I think that's where a lot of developers, a lot of system administrators, and other IT based folks get in trouble with automating things, is that they don't see all that needs to be seen in the picture. They're just thinking about this one process. If all of a sudden it's like, I need to shrink a bunch of photos down, like, okay, there are a bunch of different tools that you can use to shrink those photos down. I mean, you can use Photoshop, you can use Image Magic, or you can use the photo imaging library from Python. And like, I've used all of these tools, but I have to then think about, okay, but what's the next step? Because if I'm just shrinking them down and not worrying about any type of compression artifacting or anything like that, or if I'm not worried about what the end format is, well, that might give me a reason to use one tool. But if all of a sudden I need like a specific TIFF that uses progressive scanning, well, then I can't use certain tools. I can't use Pill for that. I have to use something like an Image Magic, or if I need to make sure that certain ratios are maintained, like that gets me a lot. And I see it all the time when I'm talking with people and I'm working with them and sharing like automation stuff, and they're like, oh yeah, I just pull down the HTML and then load it in and put my stuff in. And it's like, well, are you actually looking at what is happening with that information after it's left your hands? because you might be making your job easier, but making someone else's job a lot harder.
That hits home with me because so much of automation is contextual, right? And the stuff that works for my workflow, again, because of the specifics that you mentioned, right? Like you talked about it with images, but it could be so much more than that. It could be the process of filling out paperwork, something which I have maybe done a lot of automating at work, right? Because everything's sort of quasi digital now. So that means that you are able to access a lot of things with a browser or potentially just fill in fields on a PDF or something like that. It also, Jay, I don't know if I ever told you this, but I actually got into computers because my handwriting was so bad as a child. That my teachers were like, "Yeah, you can type whatever you want. Please, in fact, type as much as you want." And then things just sort of came from there. My first experience borrowing my mom's computer after I had written a few programs at the school computer lab in like first or second. But back to this notion of context. I think that the context is key because if you're creating any kind of automation on a computer, you're really creating something which is, if not actually a program, then certainly akin to a program, and that's really where the context comes in.
And we talked about the idea of having the full process. I think one of the best books that outlines this is the Checklist Manifesto by Atul Gawande, and in it, I mean, he really does break down like the reasoning for checklists, why checklists are so important. They talk about the idea of like a pilot having to go through a checklist every time. He might have flown hundreds of times, thousands of times, but he still wants to go through that checklist because the one time that you don't go through that checklist, that's the time that, you can get into a serious accident or things can happen. And that's something that with automation is kind of a good thing, but can also be a dangerous thing. I think you have to make sure that you are crossing every T, dotting every I when you create these tools or these processes, because any steps that are skipped, especially when you're talking about things like the healthcare industry or the military industry, those consequences can be grave. Speaking of which, let's talk about that. What are some examples of the things that you have been able to automate in just your experience?
So I think that my journey to automation began by being a really lazy high school student, and I would write programs on my calculator to do all kinds of homework for me. Then I got an internet connected computer or something that had a reliable internet connection at least. And then I started automating more kinds of homework because, there were foolish assignments or things that just weren't worth my time as a high school student. Unfortunately, all of my programming did not get me girls as I had hoped that it would, but I'm very happy now later in life. So so it all worked out. I think that I realized the power of automation when I wrote a thank you note generator for my high school graduation. And that was when I sort of saw that it was like it could really save you time. It wouldn't just remove the tedious work, but it could actually optimize and save time. And then when I became the manager of the Advanced Operating Systems Laboratory at my college, I started automating a lot of system administration tasks and sort of found that not only does it save time, but it also reduces errors. So if you fast forward to my time in the workplace, um, a lot of it actually involves healthcare, and it would amaze you the number of spreadsheets that I have processed in different jobs that might have really cool sounding titles, but in fact, it just comes down to processing spreadsheets. And I think that that's an amazing thing to realize and sort of accept about yourself, that like you're going to be processing spreadsheets for a really long time, but you're going to be processing the coolest spreadsheets and you're going to be doing it so fast and you're going to just be awesome at it, and it's going to make companies like a ton of money, and it's going to be great, right? uh, And once you accept that, I think that it sort of opens up your horizons. And I'm sure that there are a lot of other people who society will tell you that they have glamorous jobs or very interesting jobs. I find my job fascinating, and I think that computer science um, is just a wonderful thing, and it lets you tackle problems in miraculous ways and gives you a terrific tool for interacting with your universe. But I'm still a lazy guy at heart, and that means if I got to process spreadsheets to remove the main constraint, the main bottleneck in my personal process, I'm going to do it.
So you talked about the main bottleneck in your process. For me, that is often people. And I find it really hard to automate people. I've tried, it doesn't work that well. What is your secret to getting around, I guess, just having to wait for a boss to do something or wait for a colleague to do their end before you can be lightning fast on your side?
Okay, so I can actually make this pretty real. We had an issue at one point where some of our Mac OS endpoint devices were developing problems due to few pieces of software fighting one another in a corporate environment. Um, right. And in order to fix that, we created a piece of software that will rapidly run a series of what amount to configuration unit tests on your laptop. And it can run about, I don't know, 90 to 95 of them in about 25 seconds, right? On the average Mac endpoint. And what happened was we found that this saved a ton of troubleshooting with other people. If you go to someone and you say, I can relieve your burden, they will walk with you hand in hand into the beautiful sunset and toward the rainbow, because they want you to automate it because you can remove their burden. So I find that in certain cases people are very amenable to having their work automated because they would rather be focusing on a different part of it or something like that. In terms of the places where you can't really automate people, what we did was we had that program automatically generate a support ticket description that you could actually copy and paste from your terminal directly into the web form. And that saved a lot of people time and also increased clarity a great deal by enabling you to have an unambiguous ticket description that basically said, hey, here's exactly what's wrong with my laptop, right? Or nothing's wrong with my laptop, but something's still wrong, right? And that sort of removed a lot of ambiguity from the process and made people more effective. So I think that's one thing. Another thing I've done is when I'm waiting for a ticket to be approved, maybe it's an access management ticket or something, and my boss doesn't know this, but if he listens to this episode, he's going to hear it now. I actually have a couple canned emails that I have quick keyboard shortcuts for inserting, and one of them is an access management request email. So I'll be able to send it to the people who need to approve a ticket at work and basically say, hey, you're all on the hook for this. I'm just officially letting you know before the system lets you know, right? And 9 times out of 10, they are thrilled to get another thing off their plate. And I think that that's one of the things. So automating the link between you and them and the communication between you and them and removing the error prone pieces of human communication can optimize that whole process a great deal.
Yeah, I definitely like that. One of the things that I also do is the canned emails. Thank you, Text Expander. You don't
Oh,
sponsor the show, but I definitely utilize the crap out of you. So one of the things with my emails are I I can get very emotional in my responses at times. And in order to prevent that, I have created a series of responses that are a little nicer than I would be. And that does go a long way. I mean, I think the what's the saying? You can catch more flies with honey than vinegar. So for me, it's like I might have a phrase that I want to use and have it translate to "Thank you so much. Have a great day. I will be in touch," or something, something of the sort. And the recipient is none the wiser, and it also helps keep me from blowing up on someone. But I do like what you said about creating automations not just for yourself but for the people around you, for again the pre-input and the post out, or I guess the output, and where it would go on after it leaves your hands, because they wind up embracing the tools that you've made. And to, I guess, counter in that area, I have actually made automations that have made people resentful because it felt like a direct attack on their work. And I think a lot of that is, more like old school, like I get paid to crank out widgets. So if your little program can crank out widgets faster than I can, then my value has been decreased, instead of embracing it and saying, oh, with this, I can crank out more widgets too. So I think that a lot of how you automate and how you do things is the way that you structure it, the way you introduce it to your colleagues, to your superiors, and the fact that you're willing to be so open with your tools, especially in today's age where, they talk about how everybody, there are a lot of jobs out there, a lot of people looking for jobs, and a lot of it is dog eat dog. So like, if you can crank out, 100 widgets an hour and your colleague can only crank out 50, well, do you really want to help them? Because when it comes time for the promotion, it looks like your performance is better. But I think that's a nearsighted thought. And I really love that you are willing to share, to not just improve your own performance, but to improve the performance of your entire workplace.
So I think that there are a few reactions that I have to what you said, because it really I feel what you're saying here. The first is, if I understood earlier in my career the importance of being liked rather than the importance of being right, I think I would have had a very different experience historically. However, that got me where I am today, so I'm pretty happy. I think that when you were talking, the first thing that came to mind was actually Jessie Frizzell and a tweet that she had. I don't know if you follow her on Twitter, Jess Fraz.
I
She's
do.
amazing. She's great, right? She's so smart, and seems really cool. I think that one of her tweets really comes to mind. I've begun referring to it, as I saw someone else refer to this tweet, as Frizzell's first law of delegation, which is hire people who automate their jobs and keep giving them jobs. And nowhere is that more real to me in the corporate environment than software quality, where there's a large portion of the shop that is actually manual software testing, which, in my opinion, the type of manual software testing that I've encountered is a little bit like flushing money down the toilet to prove that the plumbing works, right? You've made your point, but you're never going to see that cash again. So I think that just what you said, it's about how you sort of bring the person along and introduce it. It's those soft skills that really matter. Because if they like you, it doesn't matter whether you're right or not. You can work with them, and you can achieve something great together. And just to make this really, really real, when you free up manual software testers who are good, right? When you free up good manual software testers from doing repetitive work over and over again, that sort of work, what you end up with is you end up with people who have more time for exploratory testing and actually finding bugs. So you're able to allow them to specialize and do the fun stuff, really, and everyone gets more effective in the process.
I absolutely agree. And one of the things that I wanted to ask you about is, with the move into the healthcare sector out of the startup industry, there's such a big mental shift there where a lot of people, I would even say myself included, like I think I like the startup industry because there is more opportunity for me to move outside of my, perceived area and do things that I normally wouldn't have interaction with. But you also get limited in the resources that are available to you when you're in a smaller company. And that is something that now I mean, even as a small business owner, I see that when I want to, come up with some new tool, or I want to buy some tool that I can use to automate a large portion of my job. And I look at it and it's like, oh, okay, let me call my accountant, and my accountant just says no. So I definitely get that. Is that something that you've seen as well? Just the ability to do more because there are more resources available to you?
So I think that it all balances out. And the reason for that is because when you're under the financial pressure, you find a way to do more with less, right? Versus a way to do more with more. And I think that the inefficiency of what is potentially a very large system in a lot of the corporate environments that exist, at least around the US. I'm sure other countries have similar things. But a lot of those inefficiencies might slow you down in certain ways, and the system and support that's available might free you up. So, like one thing that is expensive at a lot of companies, it can actually be in-house infrastructure, can be ridiculously expensive. Um, but the cloud, sort of as a methodology, not a destination, but as sort of a methodology, offers a variety of efficiency gains, both financial as sort of time savings, right? So the ability to sort of cons up infrastructure really, really quickly is sort of amazing. So then, of course, you have the privilege of running it and managing it yourself, which then sort of makes you wonder, maybe there's no such thing as a free lunch, because if you're saving it here, you're spending it somewhere else, et cetera, et cetera. Compare that to the time when I was in startup land, and I think that I had to be a little bit more judicious, and I definitely had more options to be judicious, um, because of the fact that I was kind of on a shoestring budget. One of the reasons that I left startups was the sort of obsession with finding more funding. The joke is that no one wants to be addicted to opium, OPM being other people's money.
I get that now. At first, I was like, "Huh, oh, okay," but yeah,
Yeah.
I totally get that, and that's something that is interesting because what I see, some of the success stories that I've seen lately, just as someone who does, a lot of work in the productivity space, is companies who created a thing to make their job easier and then wound up marketing the thing instead of whatever they were originally trying to sell. One of the biggest examples of that is the team that created Basecamp. It was so interesting that they started out as a design agency and development shop, and then they created this in-house project management tool, and then realized that what they had was very unique and very effective, and started just selling the tool. And they are a 100% bootstrapped company, and I think that that is, I mean, that's the dream. That's my personal dream. Is, I don't want to accept money from investors. I want the people that I'm serving to invest in the company with their dollars. And I mean, that's one of the reasons why, even though I'm an editor and I work with developers on their content creation, it's very important to me that I continue to create content myself and give back to the community that feeds me.
So, it's not that we needed another thing in common, Jay, but I really hear what you're saying in a lot of ways, because um, my team does a lot of, I'll call it engineering for engineering. So making products for other developers to consume. And it's much more important to me that I'm serving them and making their lives better and producing that sort of, I mean, you can look at it in a negative light, reducing developer discomfort or suffering or whatever you want to call it. But you can also look at it as trying to produce something that is, as I once heard it called, a delightful developer experience. and attempting to achieve that, I think, puts you very close to your, I'm going to use the term customer, but to the people who are consuming your services, and that keeps those feedback loops tight, which I think ultimately does make you more effective.
Yeah, it does. And the thing with that is, I mean, you might, if you've listened to the one of the last episodes we put out with Kyle Cronin, I mentioned to him as he was talking about creating applications as a learning tool to progress his career. I asked, well, have you thought about open sourcing the code for the tools that you create? And in his mind, he was like, well, the code isn't all that complicated, so I've never thought about it and don't think I would. And for me, it was a very different answer of I don't care how simple or complicated it is. I want as many people to see what I'm doing, not for the sake of maybe they'll buy it, but for the sake of if they don't know what's happening, they can use it as a learning device. If they do know what's happening with it and can improve it, then I'm still being helped. Again, I wasn't upset when Camtasia came out with, the batch processing tool that basically made the hours of work that I had put into automating that process obsolete. I was happy because it was like, well, now I know that this is going to perform better, more effective, more efficient than anything that I could have done because it's closer to the metal. And I think that is something that our little community of automators is so great about doing, is not just saying, hey, hey, I did this thing, or hey, I do this thing, or this is how I make my job easier, but here's how I do it. And being able to engage the community, have them come on the show and talk about the things that they're doing, have them join the Slack groups or talk to them on Twitter, and be able to go back and forth, we wind up learning things that we would have not gleaned on our own.
I agree completely, and that's been my experience, because I think that there's always going to be a fundamental asymmetry between sort of technical folks and their non-technical customers. The reason is that non-technical customers have to be experts of their problem domain. So let's say they sell widgets, right? They need to know everything about selling those widgets. If you're an engineer, if you're a developer, whatever, making tools for the widget sales folks, then you not only need to understand your craft well enough as a craftsperson to be able to say, hey, I know how to build software to solve problems, but you need to then have sufficient expertise. Again, that context, that all important context. You then need to have expertise in the problem space of selling widgets in order to understand the problem and sort of partner with them to build those solutions. So I think you're right.
Oh man, as someone who has been in the midst of business startupness, I could not agree more. And you bring up that point because there have been tools that I've used and I've been outside of my element. And I knew I was outside of my element, and I wanted, like, I longed for just someone to be like, it's okay, I've got you. You don't have to be a professional salesman. You just continue to crank your widgets. You're fine, and then I'll help you. But I mean, when you're a small team, that's just the way that it is, and I definitely can understand why the allure of having the stability of, like, I don't have to worry about development and sales because I work for a company of 1,000 people and 100 of those people are salespeople. Like that makes life easier. Sometimes the best automation is removing yourself from the situation.
Absolutely. I mean, listen, when everyone else is the problem, right? The answer is you might be the problem. And I've been the problem. I've been the problem enough that I know when to get out now, or at least I like to think I do. So yeah, I hear it.
Definitely. And I guess before we wrap up, the last thing, something that I mentioned in the after show with Josh Spazik is if you know everyone, you know everything. And I say that in the plea for people to get connected, get involved in the community. It is so hard to create and automate when there is a barrier or a gap in your knowledge. And the only way that you can successfully fill those gaps is if you stop trying to do it all yourself and start relying on the wisdom of the people around you. And it took me a long time to figure that out. And I think that I would be a lot further in my development career and my, what's the phrase, my automation expertise had I leaned on some of the people that I now interact with on a daily basis.
I absolutely. I think that you never want to be the smartest person in the room. You always want to be the stupidest person in the room, or maybe the second stupidest person in the room, because you really want to be able to learn from other people. That's one of the things that I love about my job, is that I work on a team with incredibly smart, committed individuals. And I think that it's one of the things that matters to me about my personal life. My wife is many times more intelligent than I am, and I respect her tremendously. And my advice for anyone who wants to listen is you find your best friend, you make sure they're smarter than you, and then you marry them. And it's worked pretty well for me.
Would she say the same thing, though?
I hope not, but I'll take it.
Well, all right. Well, this has been such a great conversation, and we've got an after show to get to. So before we do that, I have to let everyone know, if you want to hear more from Jonathan as far as productivity and automation and things, well, we're going to be talking about it a little bit more in the after show when he grills me about whatever he wants, I guess. I don't know. So if you want to catch that content, you have to become a premium member, and you can only do that at productivityintech.com/memberships. If you go there, you can sign up. It's $10 a month or $100 a year. You not only get access to all of the bonus content from all the shows, but you also get access to our PIT premium membership group inside of our public and freely available Slack channel, where you can talk with previous guests and other premium members. And we talk a lot about PIT as a podcast, as a methodology, and as a business. A lot of the business decisions I've made have come from the awesome people in that group, and you can be one of them. You also will be connected with me, where I reach out to every premium member at least once a week to see how they are doing in their walk in productivity and their walk in tech. But that's at productivityintech.com/memberships, and you can go to productivityintech.com for more information on that. Before we wrap up, Jonathan, thank you so much for being a guest on the show.
It's literally my pleasure. Happy to come back anytime, and you keep rocking it, because you're great to follow on Twitter. So thank you.
Awesome. Well, let everyone know how they can connect with you if they want to.
So the best way to find me is on Twitter. I am Yonkeltron, YONKELTRON, which has been my handle pretty much everywhere since time immemorial.
All right, everybody. Well, thank you for listening to Productivity in Tech podcast. I've been your host, Jay Miller, and this is my guest, Jonathan Magen, and a special thanks to Nadir Omawali for the use of his song, A Hustler in Spite of Myself, for the intro and outro music. And that's going to do it for this week. I am excited for next week. If you want to connect with me, you can do so on Twitter at KJAY Miller. And of course, for the latest and greatest news in productivity in tech, be sure to follow them as well at prod_in_tech. That's going to do it for Jonathan, myself, and Productivity in Tech. I'm Jay Miller, and I will talk to you next time.